There is a particular kind of silence that terrifies an avoidant more than any argument ever could. It isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It's the silence that comes after someone has quietly, finally, stopped waiting. And if that silence is something the listener recognizes, something they've created themselves after months or years of being the one who chased, who softened, who reached out first every single time, then what's about to be described is not theory, it's a mirror. Because the moment an avoidant senses that the person they slowly hollowed out has actually let go, something inside them detonates in stages, and almost nobody ever gets to witness it, because by the time it starts, the person who caused it has usually already walked far enough away not to see the wreckage behind them. This isn't a story about revenge, and it isn't a fantasy about someone coming crawling back. It's an anatomy lesson, an exploration of what happens, psychologically and physiologically, inside a person who spent an entire relationship convincing themselves that love was safer at a distance, once that distance becomes permanent. Because there is a difference, a canyon-sized difference, between an avoidant creating space and an avoidant realizing the space was accepted. The first feels like control. The second feels like free fall. Whoever is listening to this and feels a tightening in their chest already, take a breath. This isn't going to be about convincing anyone to go back, or to wait, or to hope. It's about understanding, with total clarity, what's unfolding on the other side of the door that finally got closed. And understanding, real understanding, is often the very thing that lets a person stop bleeding. Consider for a moment how strange it is that the person who spent the longest time appearing untouched by a relationship's ending is often the same person who eventually feels its loss the hardest. It seems backwards, almost unfair, that the one who gave less in the moment often ends up owing the most once the moment has passed. But grief has never operated on a schedule of fairness. It operates on a schedule of readiness, and readiness for an avoidant only ever arrives once every other option has been exhausted. To understand the panic, first the myth needs to be dismantled. The myth is that avoidants don't feel. They feel enormously. What they don't do is tolerate feeling, especially feelings that imply dependence, need, or the terrifying possibility of being truly seen and still left. Their nervous system was built, usually very early in life, around a single organising belief. Closeness is where the danger lives, not aloneness, closeness. So when someone gets close, an avoidant's body doesn't interpret it as comfort the way a securely attached person's body might. It interprets it as a threat that needs to be managed, minimised, or escaped. This is why an avoidant can look someone in the eyes, say the right words, share a bed, build a life alongside them, and still somehow keep one foot permanently outside the room. It isn't cruelty in the way it's often accused of being. It's armour. Heavy, cumbersome, exhausting armour that they've worn for so long they've mistaken it for their own skin. And the person on the other end of that relationship, the one who kept trying to get closer, kept mistaking the armour for a wall they could eventually take down with enough patience, enough softness, enough proof that they weren't like whatever taught the avoidant that love was dangerous in the first place. Here's the part almost nobody explains properly. An avoidant doesn't actually want distance from the person they love. They want distance from the vulnerability that person represents. But because they can't separate the two, the person becomes fused in their nervous system with the discomfort itself. So pulling away from a partner isn't experienced internally as pulling away from love. It's experienced as pulling away from danger, which means, cruelly, that the more someone loves an avoidant well, the more unbearable the avoidant's own nervous system can find it. Now here is the piece that changes everything. As long as the other person keeps reaching, keeps initiating, keeps softening every rupture, the avoidant's nervous system stays regulated in a strange, backwards way, because the pursuit itself becomes proof that they haven't actually lost anything. They can retreat as far as they like, because someone is always there to close the gap. It's a rhythm. Pull back, get chased, feel safe again, repeat. Most avoidant relationships operate on this exact loop for years without either person consciously naming it. But loops require two people to keep spinning. And when the person who is always the one to reach out simply stops, when the texts stop trailing off into hopeful little questions, when the silence isn't punishment, isn't a strategy, isn't a game to lure the avoidant back in, but something quieter and far more permanent, an actual and complete release, the entire architecture the avoidant was leaning on collapses without warning. This is where the panic begins. Not when the avoidant is pushing someone away, when the pushing finally works. The first stage is disorientation, and it is far stranger than most people expect. It doesn't look like sadness. It looks like confusion that refuses to make sense of itself. An avoidant in this stage will often feel an itch of unease they can't locate. Something feels off, but there's no immediate event to blame it on. No fight happened, no confrontation, nothing dramatic enough on the surface to explain the tightness gathering in their chest. This is the nervous system noticing a pattern interruption before the conscious mind has caught up. For so long, distance was met with pursuit. Now distance is being met with more distance. Quiet, patient, unreactive distance. And the avoidance body doesn't know what to do with a variable that isn't behaving the way it's supposed to. Their entire relational strategy was built on the assumption that someone else would always do the emotional labor of keeping the connection alive. Take that assumption away, and their internal compass starts spinning without a fixed direction. During this stage, the avoidant will often reach for logic to explain the discomfort. They'll tell themselves it's normal. They'll tell themselves everyone needs space sometimes. They might even feel a flicker of relief because for once, nobody is asking anything of them. But underneath the surface calm, something is quietly, involuntarily scanning for reassurance. A glance at a notification that doesn't come. A pause before opening something they used to open instinctively. A tiny, barely conscious expectation that the usual message will appear, the usual check-in, the usual proof that they are still wanted, still chosen, still safe to retreat from because retreat has always been survivable before. When that proof doesn't arrive, the avoidant doesn't consciously register loss yet. What they register is inconsistency in their own environment, which their nervous system interprets as a low-grade threat. This is the part that deserves validation for anyone listening who has been on the receiving end of an avoidance retreat for a long time. If it ever felt like the avoidant only noticed the relationship when it was withdrawn from, that perception wasn't imagined. It's an almost universal pattern in avoidant psychology. Presence gets taken for granted because it doesn't require anything of them. Absence gets noticed instantly because it introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty is the one thing an avoidance nervous system cannot quietly sit inside of. As disorientation deepens, small behavioural tells tend to surface, even if the avoidant themselves doesn't consciously connect them to what's happening. There might be a subtle uptick in checking for signs of the other person's life continuing without them. Not out of concern in the traditional sense, but out of an unconscious need to confirm the story hasn't changed. As long as the other person's life still orbits, even distantly, around the same shared history, the avoidance nervous system can tell itself nothing has really shifted. It's a way of avoiding the truth by collecting fragments of the old normal and stitching them into a temporary blanket of denial. This is also the stage where minimization becomes a coping mechanism. The avoidant will tell themselves the other person is just going through something, or busy, or reacting emotionally and will settle down. These explanations aren't lies exactly. They're a nervous system trying to protect itself from a truth it isn't ready to hold. Because underneath every minimization is an unspoken question the avoidant is terrified to ask out loud, even to themselves. What if this time there's no one coming to close the distance I created? For the person who created that silence, who finally stopped reaching, there's something important buried in this stage. The avoidant's calm exterior during this period isn't evidence of indifference. It's evidence of denial working exactly as designed. Denial's whole function is to buy time until the mind is ready for a truth the heart can't yet absorb. So if it feels unfair that the avoidant appears unaffected on the surface while someone else quietly grieved for months leading up to this point, that unfairness is real, and it deserves to be acknowledged rather than explained away. Feelings that show up late are not more valid than feelings that were ignored the whole time they were being offered. As disorientation stretches on though, it inevitably starts cracking. Denial isn't a stable foundation. It's a bridge made of paper, stretched across a widening gap, and eventually enough weight collects on it that it can't hold. That's when the second stage begins, and this one is far more active, far more uncomfortable, and, for many avoidants, far more revealing of who they actually are underneath the performance of self-sufficiency they've spent years perfecting. The second stage is best described as a frantic, often unconscious campaign to restore control. Where the first stage was internal and quiet, this stage tends to spill outward, sometimes in ways that surprise even the avoidant themselves. Because control has always been the currency avoidants trade in, emotional control, physical control, narrative control over how a relationship is remembered and understood. When they sense that control slipping entirely out of their hands, something primal kicks in, something that bypasses the careful, detached persona they've spent a lifetime constructing. This stage often begins with testing. Not necessarily direct testing through communication, though that can happen, but a kind of psychological probing designed to see whether the door is truly closed or just appears that way. An avoidant in this stage might behave, internally and sometimes externally, like someone checking a lock they're almost certain is secured, but can't stop themselves from rattling anyway. There's a compulsive quality to it, a need to know definitively whether the shift they sensed in stage 1 was temporary or absolute. What makes this stage so uncomfortable for an avoidant is that testing requires vulnerability, the very thing they've spent their whole life avoiding. To find out if someone still cares, they have to risk discovering that they don't. And for a person whose entire self-protective strategy has been built around never being the one who's left, never being the one who wasn't enough, never being the one who reached and found nothing reaching back, this risk feels unbearable. So instead of asking directly, which would require admitting need, the avoidant often oscillates between minimizing gestures and grand ones, unsure which will produce the reassurance they're unconsciously chasing. There's a specific kind of desperation that emerges here, though it rarely looks like desperation from the outside. It can look like sudden generosity. It can look like uncharacteristic warmth. It can look like an attempt to appear completely unaffected, almost performatively fine, which is itself a mask for the opposite. Whatever shape it takes, underneath it is the same engine, an urgent need to regain a sense of influence over a situation that no longer responds to the old rules. This is the stage where an avoidant's fear of abandonment, the fear they spent years disguising as independence, finally surfaces in full force. It's worth pausing here because this is one of the most misunderstood truths about avoidant attachment. Avoidants are not people who don't fear abandonment. They're people who fear it so intensely that they abandon first, as a form of preemptive protection. Their entire relational strategy is often, at its root, an attempt to never again feel the powerlessness of being left by someone they couldn't stop from leaving. So when they sense they might actually be the one being left this time, and left permanently, it isn't a mild discomfort. It's a direct hit to the exact wound their whole personality was built to protect. For the listener who spent a long stretch of time on the other side of an avoidance distance, wondering if anything they did or said or offered ever truly registered, here is something worth holding on to. The scramble that happens in this stage, however it manifests, is proof that it registered. Proof that the presence being withdrawn was never actually invisible to them, no matter how invisible it may have felt while it was being given. That doesn't rewrite history. It doesn't undo the loneliness of loving someone who couldn't fully receive it, but it does confirm something that so often gets doubted in retrospect. It was real to them too. It simply wasn't safe enough, at the time, for them to show it. As the second stage intensifies, a strange paradox often develops. The harder an avoidant tries to regain control, the more control actually slips away. Because genuine reconnection requires the very vulnerability they're incapable of accessing under this kind of pressure. They might reach out in ways that feel, to them, like enormous risks, even if from the outside those gestures look small or ambiguous. And when those gestures aren't met with the immediate return to old patterns they unconsciously expected, panic compounds rather than resolves. This is also where old defense mechanisms tend to resurface with startling intensity. Some avoidants respond to this loss of control by intellectualizing everything, turning the relationship's ending into a puzzle to be solved rather than a grief to be felt. Others respond by suddenly becoming hypercritical of themselves or of the other person, because criticism, even self-directed criticism, feels more manageable than the formless terror of simply not knowing what happens next. Still others swing into a kind of manic self-improvement, convinced that if they can just become a different version of themselves quickly enough, the loss can somehow be reversed through sheer effort. None of these responses are really about the other person anymore, even when they appear to be. They're about the avoidant's own nervous system, trying desperately to find solid ground in a situation that has stopped offering any. And this is important for anyone listening who might be tempted, in this stage, to step back in, to answer the sudden warmth or the unexpected reaching with the old instinct to rescue and soothe. What's happening here isn't necessarily transformation. It's often just panic wearing the costume of growth. Real change, the kind that would actually make a renewed connection sustainable, tends to take much longer than the urgency of this stage would suggest, and it tends to look far less dramatic and far more boring than the desperate flourishes this stage produces. There's a metaphor that captures this stage well. Imagine someone who has spent years living beside a river, never once acknowledging how much they depend on its water, taking it for granted the way people take gravity for granted, assuming it will always simply be there. Then one day, the river changes course, and rather than grieving quietly, that person starts digging frantically in every direction, trying to redirect water that has already chosen a different path, exhausting themselves in a battle against something that was never under their control to begin with, not because they suddenly love the river more, but because they've suddenly discovered how unbearable thirst actually feels. For a while, this digging can look almost convincing. It can look like the avoidant has finally arrived at the awareness everyone hoped they'd reach. But awareness under panic is different from awareness earned through reflection, and the difference usually reveals itself with time. If the digging stops the moment the panic subsides, if the sudden clarity fades the second the immediate threat of total loss no longer feels imminent, then what looked like a breakthrough was simply a nervous system doing whatever it took to survive an unbearable feeling. This isn't cynicism, it's pattern recognition. And pattern recognition is one of the most protective tools anyone healing from this dynamic can develop. Eventually, though, digging exhausts itself. There's only so long a person can sustain frantic effort towards something that isn't responding the way it used to. And when the second stage burns out, when testing produces no return to the old normal, when control cannot be reclaimed no matter how many strategies are tried, the third stage begins. This is the one most people never actually witness, because by the time it arrives, the person who finally let go has usually moved far enough into their own healing that the avoidance unraveling happens entirely out of view. The third stage is collapse, and it's the most psychologically significant of the three, because it's the stage where the avoidant is finally forced to confront the very thing their entire personality was constructed to avoid. The raw, unfiltered experience of loss without anyone available to soften it. This stage often doesn't look dramatic from the outside, if there even is an outside audience left to witness it. It tends to be internal, private, and disorienting in a completely different way than the earlier confusion of stage 1. Where stage 1 was denial and stage 2 was frantic control seeking, stage 3 is the moment the avoidance coping mechanisms simply run out of road. There's no more logic to reach for that explains away the silence. There's no more gesture left to try that might restore the old equilibrium. What's left is the thing they spent their whole life building a life around never having to feel, the full, undiluted weight of abandonment. Except this time, they can't blame anyone else for creating it. This is where old wounds, often formed long before the relationship even began, tend to surface with startling clarity. Many avoidants carry an early template, sometimes from childhood, sometimes from a formative relationship, in which closeness was met with unpredictability, or where their needs were dismissed often enough that needing anything at all started to feel dangerous. That template usually operates completely outside conscious awareness for most of an avoidant's adult life. But collapse has a way of stripping away decades of protective narrative in a short amount of time. In this stage, many avoidants aren't just grieving the end of one relationship. They're often, without realizing it, grieving every previous experience of being left, dismissed, or unseen, all of it arriving at once, unfiltered by the defenses that used to keep it at a manageable distance. There's a particular kind of terror that belongs to this stage, distinct from ordinary sadness. It's the terror of realizing that the thing you spent your whole life running from happened anyway, and that running didn't actually protect you from it. It just delayed the reckoning and often made it lonelier when it finally arrived. For an avoidant, this stage often includes the devastating recognition that their own defenses, the very strategies that were supposed to keep them safe from ever being abandoned again, are what caused the abandonment they were trying to prevent. That kind of realization doesn't resolve gently. It tends to detonate. Physically, this stage can manifest in ways avoidants aren't used to experiencing, because their whole life has often been organised around minimising physical and emotional intensity. Sleep can become elusive. Appetite can shift dramatically in either direction. There can be a persistent, hollow ache that doesn't respond to distraction the way discomfort usually did in the past, because distraction was always the tool that worked when there was still a relationship to eventually return to for reassurance. Without that possibility, distraction stops functioning as an escape hatch and starts feeling like standing in an empty room, waiting for a door that isn't going to open again. Psychologically, this is often the stage where avoidants are forced, for possibly the first time in their adult lives, to sit with need without being able to outsource its resolution to someone else. This is significant because so much of avoidant coping depends on having someone else available to chase, to reassure, to fill the emotional gaps the avoidant themselves never learned to fill on their own. When that person is genuinely gone, not performing distance as a test, not waiting in the wings for the usual rhythm to resume, the avoidant is left facing their own internal world without the usual safety net. For some, this becomes the beginning of real, lasting change. For others, it becomes a wound they simply learn to carry more heavily, without ever fully metabolizing it. It's worth being honest here, because false hope helps no one. Not every avoidant who reaches this stage transforms. Some do the deep work this collapse makes possible, if they choose to. Growth genuinely can happen here, because collapse, as brutal as it is, sometimes creates the exact kind of crack that allows real insight to enter where none could get through before. But others simply survive the collapse the same way they've survived every difficult feeling their whole life, by eventually numbing it, rationalizing it, or transferring the unresolved ache onto whatever comes next. Whether this stage becomes a turning point or just another chapter in a long pattern isn't something anyone on the outside can control, predict, or fix. And that's a difficult truth, but an important one, because so much unnecessary suffering comes from believing that someone else's collapse is a project to be managed, rather than an experience that belongs entirely to them. For the person who caused this collapse, simply by finally choosing themselves, there's something enormously important buried in all of this. None of it is a reason to reopen a door that was closed for good reasons. Someone else's panic, however real, however raw, however much it might look like the transformation that was hoped for during the entire relationship, is not evidence that returning would be safe. In fact, it's often the opposite kind of evidence. It shows what happens when an avoidant is finally faced with consequence, but it says nothing about whether that consequence will produce lasting change, or simply a temporary softening that hardens right back into old patterns the moment safety, meaning the return of the person they lost, is restored. There's a metaphor worth sitting with here. Grief, for an avoidant in this stage, often resembles a house that's been slowly filling with water for years, while its owner insisted the walls were dry, refusing every warning sign, dismissing every small leak as nothing to worry about, until one day the structure simply cannot hold anymore, and the whole thing floods at once. The flood isn't punishment, it's just physics. It's just what happens when pressure that's been ignored for long enough finally exceeds what a structure was built to contain. And nobody who has already left the house is responsible for staying behind to help mop up water they spent years begging the other person to acknowledge before it ever reached this point. This is perhaps the most important validation to offer anyone listening who recognises themselves as the person who finally gave up. If, throughout the entire relationship, there were repeated warnings, repeated moments of naming the distance, repeated attempts to prevent exactly this kind of eventual flood, and those attempts were met with dismissal, minimization, or the assumption that the relationship would simply always be there to absorb whatever was withheld, then the eventual collapse being described here isn't a tragedy that was inflicted upon the avoidant unfairly. It's the long-delayed consequence of choices that were made, again and again, often consciously, to prioritize the comfort of not feeling over the responsibility of actually showing up. It also matters to say clearly that giving up, in this context, was never cruelty. It's often the single healthiest, most self-respecting decision a person can make after loving someone who couldn't fully receive that love. Choosing to stop pouring into a connection that consistently asked for patience without ever offering reciprocity isn't abandonment in the way an avoidance nervous system might interpret it. It's boundary. It's self-preservation. And self-preservation doesn't require anyone else's permission or acknowledgement to be valid. One of the cruelest ironies of loving an avoidant is that so much of the relationship can feel like being asked to prove over and over that love is safe, all while receiving very little proof in return that the safety being offered was ever truly seen. The 3 stages described here finally answer, unmistakably, whether any of that effort registered. It did. It simply took losing it completely for that registration to break through the defences that kept it hidden the entire time it was actually happening. There's something worth sitting with about timing too, because timing is often the cruelest detail in these situations. Insight tends to arrive for avoidance only once consequence becomes real, which means the growth being witnessed in stage 3 is almost never available to the person who needed it during the relationship itself. It arrives after. Always after. And that timing isn't a coincidence. It's baked into the very psychology being described. Avoidants often can't access the depth of their own feelings, while those feelings remain theoretical, while there's still an assumed safety net of someone else's patience to lean on. It's only when that safety net disappears entirely that the feelings become undeniable enough to break through. Which means, tragically, that the version of the avoidant capable of real intimacy often only emerges once the relationship that most needed that version is already over.